A very old man with enormous wings.
Reading Buzz. The world had been sad since Tuesday. Sea and sky were a single ash-grey thing, and the sands of the beach had become a stew of mud and rotten shellfish. The light was so weak at noon that when Pelayo was coming back to the house, it was hard for him to see what it was that was moving and groaning in the rear of the courtyard. He had to go very close to see that it was an old man, a very old man, lying face down in the mud, who, in spite of his tremendous efforts, couldn't get up, impeded by his enormous wings. Frightened by that nightmare, Pelayo ran to get Elisenda, his wife. They both looked at the fallen body with a mute stupor. He was dressed like a rag picker. There were only a few faded hair left on his bald skull and very few teeth in his mouth, and his pitiful condition of a drenched great-grandfather took away any sense of grandeur he might have had. His huge buzzard wings, dirty and half-plucked, were forever entangled in the mud. They looked at him so long and so closely that Pelayo and Elisenda very soon overcame their surprise, and in the end found him familiar. Then they dared speak to him, and he answered in an incomprehensible dialect.
They called in a neighbor who knew everything about life and death to see him.
And all she needed was one look to show them their mistake.
He's an angel. He must have been coming for your child, but the poor fellow is so old that the rain knocked him down.
On the following day, everyone knew that a flesh and blood angel was held captive in Pelayo's house. Pelayo watched over him all afternoon from the kitchen, armed with his bailiff's club, and before going to bed, he dragged him out of the mud and locked him up with the hens in the wire chicken coop. A short time afterwards, they felt magnanimous and decided to put the angel on a raft with fresh water and provisions for 3 days and leave him to his fate on the high seas. But when they went out into the courtyard with the first light of dawn, they found the whole neighborhood in front of the chicken coop having fun with the angel, without the slightest reverence, tossing him things to eat through the openings in the wire as if he weren't a supernatural creature but a circus animal. Father Gonzaga arrived before 7 o'clock, alarmed at the strange news. By that time, onlookers were making all kinds of conjectures concerning the captive's future. The simplest among them thought that he should be named Mayor of the World. Others felt that he should be promoted to the rank of 5-star general in order to win all wars. But Father Gonzaga, standing by the wire, reviewed his catechism in an instant and asked them to open the door so that he could take a close look at that pitiful man who looked more like a huge decrepit hen among the fascinated chickens. He was lying in the corner, drying his open wings in the sunlight among the fruit peels and breakfast leftovers that the early risers had thrown him. Father Gonzaga went into the chicken coop and said good morning to him in Latin. The parish priest had his first suspicion of an impostor when he saw that he did not understand the language of God or know how to greet his ministers. Then he noticed that seen close up, he was much too human. He had an unbearable smell of the outdoors. The backside of his wings was strewn with parasites, and his main feathers had been mistreated by terrestrial winds, and nothing about him measured up to the proud dignity of angels. Then he came out of the chicken coop and in a brief sermon reminded them that the devil had the bad habit of making use of carnival tricks in order to confuse the unwary. Nevertheless, he promised to write a letter to his bishop so that the latter would write to the Supreme Pontiff in order to get the final verdict. Meanwhile, the news of the captive angel spread with such rapidity that after a few hours, the courtyard had the bustle of a marketplace. Elisenda, her spine all twisted from sweeping up so much marketplace trash, then got the idea of fencing in the yard and charging 5 cents admission to see the angel. The curious came from far away. A travelling carnival arrived with a flying acrobat. The most unfortunate invalids on earth came in search of health. A poor woman who since childhood had been counting her heartbeats. A Portuguese man who couldn't sleep because the noise of the stars disturbed him. A sleepwalker who got up at night to undo the things he had done while awake, and many others. In the midst of that disorder, Pelayo and Elisenda were happy, for in less than a week they had crammed their rooms with money, and the line of pilgrims waiting to enter still reached beyond the horizon. The angel spent his time trying to get comfortable, befuddled by the hellish heat of the oil lamps and sacramental candles that had been placed along the wire. At first, they tried to make him eat some mothballs, which, according to the wisdom of the wise neighbor woman, were the food prescribed for angels. But he turned them down. In the end, he ate nothing but eggplant mush. His only supernatural virtue seemed to be patience, especially during the first days when the hens pecked at him, searching for the stellar parasites, and the cripples pulled out feathers to touch their defective parts with. The only time they succeeded in arousing him was when they burned his side. He awoke with a start, flapped his wings a couple of times, which brought on a whirlwind of chicken dung and lunar dust and a gale of panic. Father Gonzaga held back the crowd's frivolity, while awaiting the arrival of a final judgment on the nature of the captive. But the mail from Rome showed no sense of urgency. It so happened that during those days there arrived in the town the travelling show of the woman who had been changed into a spider for having disobeyed her parents. A spectacle like that, full of so much human truth, was bound to defeat, without even trying, that of a haughty angel, and Pelayo's courtyard went back to being as empty as during the time it had rained for 3 days. The owners of the house had no reason to lament. With the money they saved, they built a 2-story mansion with balconies and gardens and high netting, so that angels wouldn't get in. The chicken coop was the only thing that didn't receive any attention. If they washed it down with creolin and burnt tears of myrrh inside it every so often, it was not in homage to the angel, but to drive away the dung heap stench that still hung everywhere. When the child began school, it had been some time since the sun and rain had caused the collapse of the chicken coop. The angel went dragging himself about here and there like a stray dying man. They would drive him out of the bedroom with a broom and a moment later find him in the kitchen. He seemed to be in so many places at the same time that they grew to think that he'd be duplicated, and Elisenda shouted that it was awful living in that hell full of angels. He could scarcely eat, and his antiquarian eyes had also become so foggy that he went about bumping into posts. All he had left were the bare cannulae of his last feathers. Pelayo threw a blanket over him and extended him the charity of letting him
sleep in the shed.
And only then did they notice that he had a temperature at night and was delirious with the tongue twisters of an old Norwegian. And yet he not only survived his worst winter, but seemed improved with the first sunny days. He remained motionless for several days in the farthest corner of the courtyard, where no one could see him, and at the beginning of December, some large, stiff feathers began to grow on his wings, the feathers of a scarecrow. But he must have known the reason for those changes, for he was quite careful that no one should notice them, that no one should hear the sea chanties that he sometimes sang under the stars. One morning, Elisenda was cutting some bunches of onions for lunch when a wind that seemed to come from the high seas blew into the kitchen. Then she went to the window and caught the angel in his first attempts at flight. They were so clumsy that his fingernails opened a furrow in the vegetable patch, and he was on the point of knocking the shed down with the ungainly flapping. But he did manage to gain altitude. Elisenda let out a sigh of relief for herself and for him when she watched him pass over the last houses, holding himself up in some way with the risky flapping of a senile vulture. She kept watching him even when she was through cutting the onions, and she kept on watching until it was no longer possible for her to see him, because then he was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea.